The sunlight softly illuminated the academy corridor as students sat quietly in class, focusing on the teacher. Romantica felt a wave of disappointment, noticing the classroom's old and unwelcoming atmosphere, with shadows in the corners and a cobweb hanging from the ceiling. She felt a wave of disappointment as she noticed the dust covering everything, making the already dull room feel more neglected. The unpleasant smell worsened her discomfort. With a deep sigh, she tried to push back her frustration, slumping her shoulders and briefly closing her eyes. Romantica feels overwhelmed by the unbearable state of the classroom, her frustration building as she watches the teacher write on the blackboard, unaware of the students' discontent. As she chews on her pencil, her thoughts focus on the upcoming exam, adding to her sense of frustration. Romantica feels frustrated and angry, thinking the situation is a punishment for her failure. She watches Desir, who remains calm and focused, taking notes, and struggles to understand why she is in the same class as him. Her anger grew as she watched Desir take the lesson seriously, deepening her frustration. She couldn't understand why someone with his skills, proven by his victory over the magical swordsman, would end up in the beta class. Her mind was filled with confusion and annoyance. Romantica glared at Desir, acknowledging his skills despite her reluctance. Her intense gaze unsettled him, making him feel her eyes on him. Romantica, overwhelmed by her emotions, angrily struck the desk, causing a loud echo. The teacher quickly turned to ask what was happening, while Romantica, her fists sore, felt the burden of her frustrations. Desir remained calm as he reflected on the unfair system that limited talented individuals to the beta class, stifling their potential. He thought of the many students who had suffered or died due to this, and the need for change weighed heavily on him. The idea of things remaining unchanged was unbearable. The protagonist sits at his desk, lost in thought, imagining a towering cliff while the classroom hums with activity. Romantica rests with her head on the desk, and Desir quietly observes the hidden potential around him. He clenches his fist, filled with determination, knowing that to avoid repeating past mistakes, he must follow a single path. He envisions himself standing firmly, with a red symbol behind him and another glowing symbol beneath his feet. A resolution forms within him to gather the gifted students of the beta class and elevate them to the level of the alpha class. A student walks down the school corridor, lost in thoughts about their next steps. In an almost empty classroom, Romantica sits slumped at her desk, her forehead resting on it. She feels disappointed about her place in the beta class and murmurs sadly to herself. With tired eyes, she glances up as a figure with gray hair approaches her. A gray-haired student stops by Romantica's desk, catching her attention. He asks if she is the daughter of Baron Eru, prompting her to question his identity. The conversation draws a small crowd, two of whom reprimand Romantica for being insolent. Confusion and irritation appear on her face as one student insults her and demands she stand up. The gray-haired student, Donovan, steps in to stop a confrontation, calmly taking responsibility and apologizing to Romantica. He introduces himself as a first-year student and mentions his goal of recruiting people for a group. Romantica, unfazed, remains relaxed and uninterested, wishing him success in his search for suitable members. Donovan's response is marked by a wide, toothy smile, his confidence unwavering as he explains that his presence here is part of that very effort. When Romantica raises her head to meet his gaze, her eyes reflect a blend of disinterest and curiosity. She questions him directly, seeking clarity on his intentions. In the background, beta class students observe the unfolding interaction with confusion, puzzled by the unexpected appearance of alpha class students in their domain. Desir, standing at the edge of the scene, leans slightly forward, watching the events with growing intrigue. He silently concludes that Donovan and his group have already begun their mission. Donovan, with a furrowed brow and a faint sneer, expresses disappointment in the Academy's treatment of nobles like Romantica, remarking that she has been left to languish among commoners. His contemptuous tone causes the beta-class students to avert their gazes, their shoulders drooping under the weight of his words. Romantica, however, remains composed. A faint, amused smile plays on her lips as she closes her eyes momentarily, her tone light yet pointed as she asks Donovan to explain his meaning. Romantica stood nervously, a hesitant grin spreading across her face as her teeth showed. Desir observed the scene from behind the studio, his expression marked by seriousness, while the beta-class students looked on, their faces filled with bewilderment. Donovan faced Romantica with an air of determination, indicating he intended to address the matter directly. Romantica folded her arms across her chest, her gaze fixed on Donovan as he extended his hand in a gesture of purpose. Donovan conveyed his decision to join the prestigious Blue Moon Group, a team led by an Alheim senior. He added with confidence that he believed she possessed remarkable skills and suggested she consider joining as well. Her eyes widened, and her lips parted slightly in surprise. The unexpected proposal left her momentarily speechless, as if such an opportunity came once in a rare moment. Donovan's sarcastic smile deepened, and he raised his palm as if to emphasize the gravity of his statement. He remarked that the Blue Moon Group was considered the best in Havrian Academy, boasting an unparalleled reputation. At the front stood Professor Pugman, flanked by members cloaked in blue robes with their hoods concealing their identities. It was no exaggeration to claim that the group represented the elite among the Alpha class students, showcasing unmatched talent. Romantica's expression darkened as she pursed her lips and furrowed her brows, her gaze shifting to the table with simmering frustration. Her thoughts wandered to Aegis, suspecting she was likely already part of this powerful team. The idea of joining presented itself as a potential path to advancement, perhaps the only way for her to leave the confines of the beta class. The weight of the decision pressed heavily on her as she closed her eyes and knitted her brows. Despite the turmoil of emotions, the answer seemed obvious to her, yet it was not easy to embrace. Donovan broke the silence, explaining the condition for his recommendation. Leaning a hand against the table, he presented his terms, his tone carrying an edge of audacity. Romantica stood frozen as Donovan took her hand, his intentions becoming clear. His words carried a condition that left her utterly stunned. He wanted her to become his girlfriend. A sly smile played on his lips as he bared his teeth, leaning closer to her astonished face, his demeanor brimming with insidious confidence. The hallway buzzed with activity as students moved about during recess. Amid this lively scene, Romantica stood stunned, her heart racing at the unexpected proposal. Donovan, standing before her, narrowed his eyes slightly and allowed a sly grin to play across his face. He calmly reiterated his declaration, leaving no doubt about his intentions. He wanted Romantica to be his girlfriend. Romantica's eyes widened in shock as she stared at him, unable to believe what she was hearing. Gathering herself, she questioned whether they had crossed paths before. Donovan, with a touch of nostalgia in his voice, reminded her of the ceremony before the entrance exam. It was then, he confessed, that he had fallen for her at first sight. Feeling a flush of embarrassment rise to her cheeks, Romantica instinctively pressed her hands to her chest and looked down. She hesitated before responding, explaining in a soft voice that she needed time to think. Donovan, in his usual composed manner, smiled widely and spread his hands, assuring her that he would give her all the time she needed. He emphasized his gentlemanly nature, which seemed to underline his sincerity. Leaning slightly against the desk, Donovan appeared to remember something important. Reaching into his belongings, he revealed a unique object, a wooden dagger with a polished white surface. Romantica's eyes widened in surprise as he presented it to her, explaining its significance. According to his kingdom's custom, such a dagger symbolized admiration and affection. With care, Donovan turned the dagger, its hilt facing her, and revealed a hidden compartment. Inside lay a delicate gold chain, gleaming softly in the light. Romantica could not hide her astonishment as Donovan carefully took out the chain and extended it toward her. He explained that this gift was a token of his serious intentions, a gesture meant to reflect his deep feelings. Overwhelmed, Romantica hesitated, insisting that the gift was too extravagant. But Donovan, with a reassuring smile, gently took her hand and placed the chain in her palm. He urged her to take her time to consider his proposal and assured her that there was no rush. As he turned to leave the classroom, his companions cleared the path, pushing aside the students from the beta class. Left alone, Romantica stared at the gold chain resting in her hand, her emotions a whirlwind of confusion and nervousness. Before she could fully process what had happened, a familiar figure loomed nearby. Desir, the main character, appeared suddenly, casting a shadow over her. His unexpected presence startled her so much that she dropped the chain and raised her hands in alarm. The beta students looked on, uneasy about the situation unfolding before them. Romantica, in her panic, lost her balance and tumbled from her chair, landing awkwardly on the floor. She winced, rubbing her head in mild discomfort, as Desir leaned slightly toward her, his expression unreadable. He remarked dryly that she seemed thrilled to see him, though his teasing tone carried an edge of mischief. Romantica, still flustered, quickly corrected him, explaining that he had merely startled her. Blushing with embarrassment, she glared at him, her frustration evident. Desir offered to help her up, but Romantica, determined to salvage her pride, declined firmly. She stood on her own, adjusting her chair with deliberate movements while Desire's watchful gaze lingered on her. Gathering her composure, Romantica demanded to know what he wanted from her, her voice tinged with irritation. Her fists clenched tightly, and her sharp gaze met Desire's, as the tension between them lingered in the air. The protagonist gazes at Romantica, his expression serious. His lips part slightly, revealing a hint of teeth as he prepares to offer her the same proposition that Donovan had once given her. Romantica instinctively wraps her arms around herself, her eyes filled with horror as she stares back at him. She immediately rejects the idea, stating she would never date someone like him. However, Desire interprets her response as something entirely different. Frustrated, Romantica folds her arms on the desk, resting her head upon them. She tells Desire to stop avoiding the issue, as she's not in the mood for games. The protagonist, with a blank expression, looks at her, his mouth slightly open in quiet curiosity. He asks her what's wrong. Romantica lifts her head from her arms, a look of dissatisfaction clouding her face. Raising her hand, she reveals a gold chain, which catches the protagonist's attention. His eyes widen, his confusion evident. Romantica clenches the gold chain into a fist, asking him what he would do if he were in her place. Who would he choose? An invitation from an elite group in the Alpha class, where success is assured, or a nameless group from the Beta class, created by someone unknown? Desire, his lips pursed in thought, studies her. Romantica stretches out her arms on the desk, resting her chin on her hands as she waits for an answer. She poses the question to him again, her lips curling slightly. The protagonist narrows his eyes, a frown settling on his face as a wave of sadness washes over him. He knows she has already made her decision, and it would be nearly impossible to change her mind now. Romantica, her frustration clear, lies across the desk, her eyes fixed irritably on him. Desire realizes that this may be the worst choice she could have made. He stands tall, arms at his sides, his head lifted. Romantica, on the other hand, waves her hand dismissively. The protagonist, feeling the weight of the moment, acknowledges that his chances are slim. Romantica agrees with a sharp reply, signaling that it's time for him to leave her alone. Desire, slipping his hands into his pockets, asks if she would care to take a look at something. Romantica, surprised, doesn't understand what he means. Desire extends his hand, placing a small envelope on the desk before her. She picks it up, her gaze filled with confusion. The envelope appears old-fashioned, and she comments that no one writes letters like this anymore. The protagonist raises his hand to his face as Romantica stares at him, puzzled. He tells her that if the letter means nothing to her, she can simply discard it. His gaze remains indifferent as he adds that inside the letter lies her secret. Romantica's eyes widen in horror, her heart racing. Without thinking, she tears open the envelope and lowers her head, reading the contents with intense focus. As she reads, her hands tremble, and she crumples the letter in her grip. Desire watches her actions with detached indifference. He asks her if, now that she's seen the letter, she's ready to talk. Romantica, visibly shaken, stands up abruptly, slamming her palms against the desk. Her classmates turn their attention toward the scene, unsure of what's happening. The protagonist, his gaze cold and unwavering, warns her not to cause a scene. He wants to keep this secret between them. Romantica, her head bowed, opens her mouth, but no words come out. She can't comprehend how he even knows about the letter. The sunlight from the window casts a reflection on the ceiling, further intensifying the moment. Desire, unmoved, reminds her that he's not obligated to explain himself. Romantica grips the crumpled letter tightly, leaning against the desk. Desire's voice cuts through the silence as he tells her that she already knows the true reason why she's here. Romantica, her teeth clenched in frustration, silently accepts that the protagonist knows why she's been placed in the Beta class. Romantica's anger was evident as she glared at the protagonist. With a sharp motion, she placed her hands on the desk, her eyes flashing with fury. Desire, calmly tilting his head, met her gaze from under his long bangs, a quiet suggestion leaving his lips. He mentioned that it would be better for their conversation to take place outside, where it was quieter and more private. Romantica, still seething, reluctantly agreed and followed him out into the clear, sunny weather, the warmth of the sun radiating through the dense trees. Standing across from Desire around the corner of the school, Romantica demanded to know if he had shared her secret. Desire calmly assured her that he had not told anyone directly, but many of the local professors already knew the truth. Romantica, feeling a twinge of embarrassment, looked away as she lowered her head. Desire continued, explaining that it was precisely why she had been placed in the Beta class. Her eyes shot back to him, full of rage, as she questioned how anyone could know, given that the academy was far from the Pralesha kingdom. Desire, with a knowing expression, stated that she had underestimated Havrian Academy's ability to gather information. He added that her family's origins were no secret, a merchant family that grew wealthy through trade, and her purchase of a noble title from a poor baron in the south. He paused for a moment, his hands in his pockets as he explained how this had all happened when she was only 4 years old. Romantica's frown deepened, her anger rising as she struggled to understand how Desire knew all of this. Desire, his gaze firm, told her that she could claim noble blood all she wanted, but it wouldn't change the fact that she was born a commoner. Moreover, Professor Sor Niflika, who led the Blue Moon group, was one of the few who knew the truth about her origins and despised people like her. Romantica's eyes widened in disbelief as she tried to hold on to the hope that Donovan, someone she believed would protect her, would shield her from the consequences. Desire, sensing her doubts, calmly explained that Donovan's treatment of commoners was hardly the type to inspire trust. Romantica's eyes grew wide as she pictured Donovan's disapproving gaze, imagining how he might look at her once he learned the truth. Desire spread his arms out as he asked her what her next move would be, his voice calm yet insistent. Romantica, still angry and unwilling to back down, demanded to know if Desire truly thought he could force her to join his group. Desire, momentarily caught off guard, smirked and agreed that it wasn't right to force her. He then offered her a proposition, one that was far from what she expected. He told her that she would only have to stay in his group for 1 month, and if she didn't like it, she could leave at any time. Romantica, still skeptical, frowned, knowing that Desire's words couldn't be entirely trusted. However, she was surprised when he extended his hand to her, offering a handshake. Reluctantly, she accepted, though her confusion was evident as she looked at him. Desire's satisfied smile as they shook hands only deepened her frustration, but they both understood this was the agreement. Romantica, still bitter, explained that Desire had been a constant source of irritation since the entrance exam. Desire, with a playful grin, admitted that he had known that from the start. Their school, surrounded by towering trees, seemed to add to the tension in the air. As they sat together at a long, empty table, Romantica, still upset, tore into a loaf of bread. Her displeasure was clear as she held up the hard, stale pieces, expressing her disgust at how inedible it was. Desire, sitting across from her with a calm expression, had already finished his meal. He nonchalantly explained that the bread was perfectly fine, and far better than the meat of an orc. Romantica, still holding the bread in her hands, scowled. This was not how she imagined her day would go. Romantica immediately felt a wave of embarrassment, shrinking inwardly as she realized how disgusting her words had sounded. She quickly attempted to salvage the situation by turning it into a joke, explaining that it was meant as a figure of speech and that she had never tasted orc meat. As she dipped her bread into the bowl of yellow soup in front of her, she went on to explain that creating a group was far from easy. Desire, resting his head on his crossed arms, listened attentively. Romantica continued, pointing out that they were only 2, but at least 3 people were needed, as several strong groups had already formed in the beta class. She added that most of the freshmen would probably want to join them, but she also emphasized how difficult it would be to attract new members since no one knew about their group. With a mouthful of food, Romantica glanced at Desire. Her brow furrowed as she asked what he had to say in response to her statements. Desire closed his eyes in contentment, a smile spreading across his face as he kept his arms crossed. Romantica, wiping her mouth with her fingers, looked at him eagerly, her eyes lighting up as she noticed his amused expression. Desire turned to her, reminding her that she had once said how terrible it would be to be in his group, but now she seemed to be showing interest in her fate within it. Romantica, her face flushed with irritation, immediately reacted. She waved her arms and began arguing in a fit of hysteria, insisting that she was only concerned about the group because she feared how terrible the next month would be. She declared that she was doing it purely for her own sake. Desire, still smiling, continued to look at her with admiration, which only fueled Romantica's anger further. In frustration, she threw a spoon at his forehead. Her cheeks were puffed up with rage, and her fists were clenched as she glared at him. Desire, attempting to calm her, reassured her that there would be no problems. He knew a professor who could help them, and he already had someone in mind to join the group, someone who just needed a little persuasion. Romantica's voice rang out angrily, her words echoing that she should have said all this from the beginning. As they walked along the road leading through the school's coniferous front garden, the view was beautified by the tall trees lining their path. Desire walked ahead, a satisfied look on his face, while Romantica trailed behind, still offended. Romantica, curious about the person Desire had in mind, asked who it was. Desire, with a slight smile, mentioned that the man's name was Pram Schneider. He was a swordsman from the Beta class, known for surviving 9 years in the Shadow Labyrinth, a testament to his incredible skills. As they approached a large hall with several platforms where competitions were held, the scene became busier. Desire sat on a podium, while Romantica struggled to find a clean seat, grumbling in annoyance. The mixed classes of the Alpha and Beta groups had led to this chaotic situation, and she couldn't help but feel frustrated by it. Suddenly, she remembered Pram and began to scan the crowd, eager to spot him. Desire, his expression slightly frowning, reminded Romantica of the swordsman's characteristics, a blue-haired figure clad in white armor with a long sword, known for his unmatched skill in battle. Desire believed Pram was one of the most outstanding talents in the Beta class. He had witnessed Pram's persistence and dedication, which made him confident that Pram was a swordsman like no other. Romantica, now curious, eagerly looked around, her eyes wide with anticipation. Desire, still sitting calmly, observed the crowd, his attention caught by a figure who seemed to fit the description. With a grin, he turned to Romantica, pointing out that their hero had arrived. Pram appeared, his movements graceful as he warmed up, preparing for the competition ahead. He sighed deeply as he stretched, his blue eyes scanning the crowd. Romantica, noticing the skilled swordsman, couldn't help but feel a sense of awe as Desire watched Pram with quiet admiration. Pram continues to stretch his shoulder girdle, completely unaware of the conversation unfolding around him. Romantica, with a tone full of surprise, fails to understand just how charming and sweet Pram truly is. Desire watches with a grin, amused as Romantica looks at Pram with admiration, almost idolizing him. Desire, always calm, compares Pram to a sweet pearl, a thought that causes Romantica to clench her fists. She insists that Pram's charm cannot be compared to that of a mere pearl. Romantica, in a bloodthirsty manner, glares at Pram, overwhelmed with emotion. The realization hits her. Pram is the very definition of cute, and she finds herself wondering why she has yet to learn more about him. Meanwhile, Pram, ever so oblivious, slightly closes his eyes and scratches his nose, his innocence radiating as Romantica continues to praise him. She excitedly announces that she would adopt him if she could and vows to give up all her savings to do so. Desire watches the scene in bewilderment, struggling to understand Romantica's sudden obsession with Pram. At that moment, Pram stands before a rack of swords, trying to choose one. The selection is overwhelming, and for a brief moment, confusion crosses his face. His gaze settles on a particular sword, and he reaches for it, pulling out a large wooden sword. Desire and Romantica watch in awe as Pram holds the massive weapon. The protagonist, unable to hide his shock, stares in disbelief, realizing that Pram has chosen a two-handed sword, a weapon far different from his usual rapier. Romantica's eyes widen in confusion as she wonders why a magician like Pram would choose such a weapon. The scene shifts to an intense moment. Pram stands before a red-haired Alpha-class enemy, ready for battle. The Alpha player looks at Pram with pity, while Pram bows his head and places his hand over his chest, introducing himself. The red-haired opponent, arms crossed and with a slight sneer, arrogantly dismisses Pram's introduction, making it clear that he has no intention of engaging with a Beta loser. The judge, standing at the edge of the platform, commands the fighters to prepare. With a sharp wave of his red flag, the sparring match begins. Pram, filled with determination, charges at his opponent, his sword aimed for a strike. But the Alpha player blocks the attack, a fierce look crossing his face as he counters with his own sword. Pram's powerful blow lands, sending the Alpha player stumbling back. Desire watches intently, noting that if Pram had been armed with his usual rapier, the battle would be much easier. Romantica, watching with a mixture of awe and worry, notes that Pram's cuteness does not make up for his lack of swordsmanship. The battle intensifies. The Alpha player, seething with anger, launches a barrage of attacks at Pram. Pram, struggling to dodge the relentless blows, closes his eyes tightly in concentration, bracing for the next strike. He waits for an opening to strike back, but the Alpha player is relentless. With a grin, the Alpha player moves in for a finishing blow, but Pram, determined to fight, readies his huge sword. In the heat of the moment, Pram miscalculates. His attack goes wide, and the Alpha player, sensing the opening, swiftly strikes Pram's weak arm. Pram's sword is knocked from his hand, and he falls to the ground, clutching his arm in pain. The Alpha player watches in confusion as Pram, despite the setback, rises to his feet. Pram, with a pitiful look in his eyes, glances at the sword lying on the floor, realizing that he has lost this round. Romantica, in disbelief, turns to the main character, asking why Pram, who had seemed so strong, failed. Desir, ever the strategist, explains that Pram tires easily from his movements, and even beginners do not make such basic mistakes. The main character, looking at Pram with a sense of disappointment, notes that despite Pram's adorable appearance, his sword skills have fallen short. Romantica, equally disappointed, suggests they look for another student. As the tension in the air rises, Pram casts a mournful glance to the side. But then, something unexpected happens. Pram turns around, his determination renewed. Romantica's eyes widen as she watches Desir suddenly move from his position, and the alpha player, sensing weakness, moves in for the kill. He swings his fist, aiming to finish off Pram once and for all. The attention of the others in the room shifts toward the loud cry of the main character, who urgently tells the alpha player not to finish off Pram. Pram cringes tightly, bracing for the blow that strikes his face with tremendous force. The alpha player stands over him, continuing to swing his fist relentlessly. Desir, anger flashing across his face, walks toward the ring where the alpha player is finishing off Pram. With frustration in his voice, Desir demands to know why the alpha player is doing this. The alpha player dismisses the beta players as scoundrels unworthy of his attention, arrogantly straightening his collar with a beaten hand. He continues to mock them, calling the beta players disgusting, and looks down at the protagonist with disdain. Desir, who is about to step into the ring to confront the alpha player, pauses when he sees Pram lying motionless on the floor, still suffering from the brutal blows. Desir shouts, insisting that this is no justification for the alpha player's actions. The main character walks toward the prone Pram, while the alpha player pulls his sword, threatening Desir, and telling him to leave the field if he doesn't want the same fate as Pram. Desir, refusing to back down, questions the alpha player about his behavior. His gaze shifts to Pram, who begins to recover, albeit slowly, holding his cheek and letting out a heavy sigh. Desir reflects on how the alpha player lacks any honor despite his position. The alpha player lowers his sword, seemingly regretting his actions, but Desir explains that the alpha player's pride was wounded. He had been forced to use his full strength against a beta-class student. The alpha player furrows his eyebrows sharply, his gaze growing bloodthirsty as he clutches his sword tightly. Desir looks at him, questioning his intentions. In the blink of an eye, the alpha player swings his sword, aiming for Pram's head. Pram shuts his eyes, bracing for the next strike. A sudden blow lands, but it is not the alpha player's sword that strikes. A drop of blood falls on Pram's face as he opens his eyes, seeing Desir's bloodied hand, still raised to protect him. The alpha player is left in shock, staring at his broken sword, unable to comprehend how Desir managed to block his blow with such speed. Desir, still holding his injured hand out, questions the alpha player, asking if he really intended to harm the defenseless Pram once again. Pram watches in disbelief as the sword piece flies through the air. The alpha player, sweating and confused, stares at his hand, unable to understand how Desir was able to block the blow so quickly. With a slight grin, Desir calmly explains that the sparring match was already over and that he had won. The alpha player's eyes widen in surprise as he stares down at Desir, his frown deepening. Confusion spreads across his face as he looks at the others, realizing that he has seen these eyes before. A memory resurfaces from his childhood, back in the big country town. He had tried to justify himself to his master when a commoner was seen near their mansion, thinking that the man deserved to be defeated by him. The alpha player remembers standing in front of his master, tears in his eyes, only to be met with a cold, contemptuous glare from the elder. The memory fades, and the alpha player turns from the battlefield, walking away, tired of the entire situation. Desir sits on the floor, calling out after the alpha player, expressing relief that none of the professors had witnessed his disgraceful actions. The alpha player, without turning back, simply snorts and yells at Desir to stop giving him lectures. Romantica and Pram surround Desir on the battlefield, finally understanding the true nature of the alpha player. Desir smiles at his friends, who look at him with confusion and concern, struggling to comprehend the kind of man he has become. The sun's rays reflect off the roof of the multi-story building, casting a warm glow on the surroundings. Inside, in a spacious office, Pram carefully bandages Desir's hand while Romantica sits in a chair, observing. Romantica playfully tells Desir not to complain, asking why he even got involved in the conflict in the first place. Pram, still worried, asks if Desir's injury is serious. Romantica laughs heartily, teasing him with a smirk, amused by the sight of him in such a state, and joking that it's karma for the way he had treated her. At the entrance, Desir observed Pram's bandaged hand, which had been tied with a Pram bandage, and made a bow out of it. Sitting across from Pram, Desir raised his hand and examined it with a smile. Pram bowed his head with a look of regret, apologizing sincerely for what had happened. Desir, relaxed on the sofa, swung his arms slightly as Pram added that, due to the injury on his right hand, it would now be difficult for the protagonist to perform his daily activities. Leaning slightly forward, the protagonist, sitting on the floor with a sad expression, reassured Pram not to worry. He made it clear that he had chosen to get involved in their fight. Feeling the weight of the situation, Pram closed his eyes, taking all the blame upon himself, believing that he was responsible for everything that had transpired. Desir, however, smiled and reassured him that everything would be fine. With a sorrowful expression and a faint blush on his face, Pram lowered his gaze, confessing that he had dragged the protagonist into the showdown and made him an enemy of the alpha class. In response, Desir simply grinned and closed his eyes, reminding Pram that he had been fully aware of the consequences when he chose to intervene. Romantica and the protagonist watched Pram, who, feeling unexpectedly supported, seemed to find new hope. Romantica thought that Pram looked rather cute in that moment. The medicine box on the table caught their attention as Pram began to snap back to reality. With a smile, he suggested that they had never introduced themselves, so he would do so first. Desir and Romantica smiled warmly, introducing themselves and expressing their pleasure at meeting him. Pram suddenly turned to the protagonist, who looked puzzled, and told him that Desir could simply call him by his name. Slightly embarrassed, Pram shyly averted his gaze, not wanting to be formal. He clarified that the protagonist should just address him by his name. Both the protagonist and Romantica smiled at the simple exchange. Desir, with a hint of irony, joked that this should have been the normal way of things. Pram, blushing deeply, laughed in response, feeling quite embarrassed. Desir, observing him, couldn't help but smile, realizing that Pram's blush was a sign of his liking for the situation. As they noticed the time, the gold watch hanging on the wall indicated that it was getting late. They all agreed that it was time to leave. Standing together in the spacious corridor of the educational institution, the protagonist turned to Pram, suggesting that he could speak to him in a less formal way. Desir added that, since they were the same age, it was perfectly fine. Pram, however, replied that it didn't bother him at all, and he intended to continue addressing the protagonist with great respect. He bowed his head and body, expressing deep gratitude for the help he had received. He promised never to forget their kindness and assured them that he would be there to help, without hesitation, should the need arise. The protagonist, touching his chin, inquired about Pram's last words. With joy and excitement, Pram clenched his fists, eagerly declaring that he would do anything the protagonist asked. Desir, with a satisfied smile, invited Pram to join his group. Pram's eyes shone with joy as he immediately accepted the invitation, stating that he would join without hesitation. Romantica and Desir observed as Pram radiated happiness and admiration. Pram, filled with enthusiasm, eagerly talked about officially joining their group, and the protagonist, sensing his excitement, asked if he was truly ready for it. A faintly cloudy sun cast its gentle light over a white building, its blue roof and matching accents standing out against the soft illumination. The rays of sunlight filtered through the windows, flooding the corridors with a warm glow. Nearby, the quiet was broken when someone inquired about the scheduled meeting. Close to the entrance, 3 academy students stood together, a girl and 2 boys. One of the young men, exuding confidence, reassured the others that all arrangements had already been made. Inside the building, the room's owner turned her head sharply toward the door, her expression betraying her surprise at the unexpected disturbance. Desir stepped inside, his presence drawing attention to the room's serene layout. On his right, a cozy dining area featured red sofas and cups of tea resting on the table. To his left, a cabinet adorned with a vase holding a vibrant plant added a touch of charm. He offered a polite apology for the intrusion, while Romantica, visibly curious about the hostess, stood just behind him. Her eyes flitted between the blue-haired girl and the figure of a woman in a striking red dress. The woman, revealed to be Professor Briette, stood before them with poise. Her short hair framed her face, and her cream-toned makeup accentuated her features. The red dress she wore, with daring cutouts running up from the hips, showcased her elegance, her legs adorned with black stockings and heels. Desir, overwhelmed by a wave of nostalgia, closed his eyes and remarked how long it had been since their last meeting. Briette, acknowledging his words with a nod, welcomed her guests warmly, her demeanor both gracious and composed. As Desir expressed his gratitude, Romantica found herself mesmerized by the professor's beauty, while Pram shyly sought refuge behind the group. Briette's keen eyes soon caught sight of an injury on Desir's hand, but her concern was met with a dismissive response, brushing it off as insignificant. On the table, delicate white teacups edged with golden patterns awaited the guests. Briette gracefully poured tea, inviting everyone to sit. Her smile hinted at her surprise as she reminisced about Desir's extraordinary performance during his entrance exam. She confessed it had been unlike anything she had witnessed before. Desir, visibly flustered, scratched the back of his head and let out a nervous laugh, attempting to downplay the praise. Briette, however, placed a brimming cup on its saucer with an air of conviction, asserting that his skillful use of magic during the exam was indeed remarkable. She referenced the Aegis King's crown. A formidable competitor, yet Desir had emerged victorious. Her insistence left him no room for modesty. Romantica, sipping her tea with enthusiasm, couldn't help but marvel at its delightful taste. Meanwhile, Briette's expression shifted to one of playful mischief as she teased Desir, recounting how she had once doubted his potential. Her words, though laced with humor, carried a subtle sting. Placing a hand on her cheek, she feigned a sense of betrayal at his surprising success. The pressure of her remarks visibly unnerved Desir, his sweat betraying his discomfort as he struggled to respond. Despite the tension, the atmosphere retained an undercurrent of lightheartedness, leaving the scene both dynamic and memorable. Briette held her hand over her mouth, laughing freely, while the main character's shoulders drooped under the weight of guilt. Lowering her gaze, she brushed off the joke and urged the guests to drink their tea before it went cold, mentioning how difficult it had been to gather the leaves from Romantica. The latter, pressing a fist to her mouth, stifled her amusement as the disgruntled brunette beside her cast a sharp glance her way. Pram watched as their hostess placed a steaming cup of tea on the table, expressing her happiness that the young man was doing well. Her words drew the attention of everyone present, and the brunette met her gaze, his curiosity piqued. The hostess wondered aloud about his reasons for forming his own group, prompting his eyes to light up with determination. He explained that his goal was to advance to the Alpha class by passing a rigorous qualifying exam. As the steam from the tea curled around her face, the hostess's eyes mirrored his spark of enthusiasm. She folded her hands neatly in her lap and gently questioned if he truly understood the enormity of the task. He met her gaze with unwavering resolve, raising his hands to chest level as if to steady his conviction. His response was met with a satisfied smile from his opponent, who momentarily closed her eyes in thought. Pram, intrigued, asked for clarification about moving to the Alpha class. The hostess elaborated on the Academy's promotion system, explaining how students earn their ranks. She described a selection process where 30 students were chosen to enter the 5th level Shadow World to complete specific tasks. The top 9 performers, identified by their white robes, would be granted the prestigious first-rank title. However, she emphasized that the young man's ambitions stretched beyond merely transferring to Alpha. His sights were set on achieving a place among the top 9. Romantica and the young man listened attentively as the hostess highlighted the challenges. Rising from her seat, the girl sought confirmation of her understanding, to which Desir furrowed his brows and firmly affirmed her interpretation. Another girl, her hair tied in ponytails, seemed stunned. Looking at her friends in disbelief, she jumped up, exclaiming her astonishment at what she had just heard. She argued vehemently that merely reaching the top 30 would be an achievement, yet even that would face significant opposition due to their beta-class origins. The brunette observed her with calm confidence, while the blue-haired individual expressed visible concern. The group's attention shifted back to the hostess, who, sitting upright in her chair, raised her voice to declare agreement with the girl's argument. She explained how the top 30 primarily consisted of elite students from large groups, most of whom belonged to the Alpha class. The blue-haired person interjected, elaborating that beta students who reached that level would inevitably face hostility, as their presence would threaten the established hierarchy. The hostess nodded in agreement, her gaze lingering on the cooling cup of tea. Briette, deep in thought, repeated the warning about becoming targets for Alpha students. The young man acknowledged the risk but argued that attaining the first-rank title would secure their position. The girl with ponytails corrected him, emphasizing that achieving such a rank was imperative. Sighing heavily, she resumed her seat, her expression weighed down by doubt. Briette raised an eyebrow as the student encouraged her to consider the potential implications. The brunette, with unshakable confidence, proposed that if beta students managed to succeed as a team of 3, it would expose the absurdity of the current system. The hostess furrowed her brows, reciting her reservations while grappling with his reasoning. The cup of tea, now forgotten, sat cooling beside the teapot. After careful contemplation, the woman finally gave her approval for the creation of the group, though she attached a condition. Fixing her sparkling gaze on the main character, she insisted on first ensuring certain prerequisites were met. Turning to Romantica, she called upon her and the blue-haired girl, inquiring whether they were willing to join the group after everything they had just heard from the determined brunette. The bright rays of the sun illuminated the forest path, casting a golden glow on everything in its reach. In the heart of this scenic beauty stood the Havrian Academy's training center, with its towering blue statue gleaming brilliantly under the sunlight. Inside, students were engrossed in activities, engaged in a mock battle arena, and exploring a virtual space where they simulated escaping from massive explosions. Among them was a ponytailed girl who observed everything with awe. Following her friends, she marveled at the incredible facilities, wishing they could be allowed to use such arenas themselves. Above the entrance, a sign with the word Alpha hung prominently. The sight filled her with a mix of admiration and envy as she expressed her longing to be part of such experiences, imagining that having access to these resources would make her cherish the academy forever. Ascending to the top floor of the training center, the group arrived at what was supposed to be their assigned training room. To Romantica's surprise and growing irritation, it turned out to be nothing more than a dusty, abandoned attic. Her disbelief was evident as she questioned whether this was some kind of joke. The brunette beside her tried to explain that this space could not be compared to the grand facilities they had seen earlier, but her words did little to ease Romantica's frustration. Suddenly, something darted past the blue-haired girl, and she instinctively covered her mouth in fear, her wide-open eyes revealing her terror. A scream escaped her lips, drawing the attention of the other students. Pram leaped up in alarm, pulling his leg close as he nervously pointed out that something had just moved there. The young man in the group brushed it off with a casual remark, suggesting it might just be a rat. But the ponytailed girl was visibly distressed by the idea. Bowing her head, she trembled with unease. Her reaction left the young man feeling awkward, his nervousness betraying his attempt to remain calm. Seeing the growing tension, he tried to lighten the mood, but instead, he pushed the frightened Romantica into the attic. She shrieked, trying to escape, but he quickly shut the door. His hand hovered over a switch as the girl frantically muttered fears about being devoured by rats. Just as the others tried to reassure her, the room came to life. Bright magic stones illuminated the space, glowing softly along the walls. The young man, with a hint of satisfaction, suggested this made the room more appealing, though the girl remained on edge. Suddenly, the lights flickered off, plunging them into darkness. A moment later, hundreds of glowing eyes appeared in the shadows, fixing their eerie gaze on the group. Romantica's fear escalated as the rats began rushing toward them. Her scream pierced the silence, echoing through the academy. The brunette grabbed the blue-haired girl tightly, trying to protect her. Amidst the chaos, the ponytailed girl clung to the young man, wrapping her arms around his neck in sheer panic. He awkwardly held both girls, struggling to maintain his balance as the rats scurried around them. The scene reached its peak when Romantica, still overwhelmed with fear, shouted her refusal to let go. The young man glanced at a glowing stone in the room, a determined expression crossing his face. He declared that drastic action was necessary, leaving Romantica both confused and hopeful that they might finally leave. However, her relief turned to disbelief when he instructed her to clean the floor while he worked on sealing the rat holes. Tears welled up in her eyes as she looked at him in stunned silence, her earlier hopes fading as she reluctantly accepted her new task. Romantica, overwhelmed with indignation, started striking the boy in frustration, accusing him of wanting her gone. Desir, on the other hand, responded with a calm, satisfied expression, sharing his intent to make full use of their surroundings. Her confusion deepened as she raised an eyebrow, trying to make sense of his strange resolve. The boy, frail and barely clinging to consciousness, found himself surrounded by uncertainty. The attic's windows stood wide open, allowing the chill to sweep through the space. The blue-haired man, sitting on a step of the staircase, leaned against the wall for support. His hazy gaze swept the room, struggling to piece together where he was. Slowly gathering his strength, he stood, casting a hesitant glance at the others. The brunette, framed against the dissatisfied figure of the girl, greeted him warmly, sharing that they had been about to wake him. The boy's expression twisted in disbelief as he noticed the place looking spotless. The brunette, relaxed on a pile of boxes, casually mentioned that the cleaning had been completed. Shock filled the boy as he demanded to know how someone with an injured hand managed such a task. Concern furrowed his brow as he clenched his fists, his voice trembling with resentment. His frustration brimmed with unspoken pain, as if tears were threatening to fall. The brunette, unfazed, apologized with an air of ease and urged the boy to shift focus to something new. The girl, unimpressed, grumbled her dissatisfaction while the brunette, now in high spirits, declared it time to train. The mention of tea crossed the girl's mind, along with the thought of a woman's earlier question about joining the brunette's group. She sank into a chair, grappling with doubts about the entire notion. To her, it seemed absurd. There were many others at the academy far more capable than she was. As a second circle magician, she couldn't envision herself breaking into the academy's elite. Her thoughts drifted to the brunette, whose confident demeanor stayed etched in her memory. Frustration flickered within her as she leaned to the side, unable to shake off the irritation he stirred in her. The recollection of his pleased expression during their last meeting filled her with reluctant resignation. The warm rays of the sun illuminated the academy's facade, and Romantica, already regretting her decision, covered her face in dismay. The boy's gaze rested on her as she announced the start of training. Despite her conflicted emotions, she turned to him with a spark of enthusiasm, signaling her reluctant acceptance of his lead, leaving fate to decide the outcome. In one of the rooms of a house, a conversation unfolded about an empty, spacious room behind the next door. Desire rummaged through a drawer, speaking about how this room could be used for training and as an office. The young man straightened up, announcing that he had found it. Romantica, curious, asked what he had discovered. The main character pulled out a ball and explained that it would be used for practice, handing it to Romantica. He then pointed out that she needed to work on her spell casting speed. Romantica rolled her eyes, replying that her speed was already quite high, and the young man should have noticed this during the entrance exam. Looking at her offended expression, the main character shrugged, acknowledging her words. Desire, agreeing with her, confirmed that her speed was good but added that it was only suitable for a mediocre magician. He emphasized that the speed of Alpha-class students was hundreds of times faster than hers. Desire told her that if she intended to fight with them, she would be at a disadvantage, even if her skills were on par, as winning would still be difficult. Romantica, now sweating, asked if the young man truly believed there was a way to improve her abilities so quickly. Desire nodded, holding out the ball to her, just inches from her tired face. He explained that this ball was the key. With a serious expression, Desire said that from now on, Romantica would need to use it to create spells without words. Romantica opened her mouth in surprise, unable to comprehend how spells could be cast without words. Desire smiled, closing his eyes, and explained that it was possible, but the girl simply couldn't feel it yet. He elaborated that, typically, spells were activated only after being cast, but with non-verbal casting, she could activate a spell instantly. Romantica, placing a hand on her face, doubted it, suggesting that this was only theoretical. Desire, turning his back to her, denied it, confident that she would succeed. As he faced Romantica again, he noticed her offended look and said that if she refused to believe him, she could go off and chew her stone bread. Romantica, now regaining her strength, asked what exactly she needed to do, her voice echoing through the room. Desire began moving chalk across the floor, drawing a circle, which he circled around the girl, who had no idea what he was doing. Romantica took the ball from his hands, looking at him questioningly. Desire pointed her to the opposite circle, instructing her to move the ball there. Romantica smiled, preparing to throw it, but the main character immediately stopped her, reminding her that she couldn't throw it because she was a magician. The heroine's eyes widened as Desire told her to move the ball without physical contact, relying only on the air around it. He smiled when she replied that she would try. Romantica sat down beside the ball, deep in thought. She wondered how she could control the airflow around it. It was as difficult as someone trying to fly with wings, an almost impossible sensation for an ordinary person to grasp. Her eyes widened, and she focused all her energy on the ball, assuring herself that she would master this technique. She believed that once she did, she would be able to cast any first circle spell without words. Desire, suddenly serious, added that simply looking at the ball wouldn't make it move. Romantica, frustrated, shouted that she knew that. The girl grew curious as Desire mentioned how she had used magic while cleaning. Surprised, Romantica remembered moving objects out of her way, and justified it by saying the box had been very heavy. Raising his finger, Desire pointed out that she had used magic because she wanted to move the object, and he was sure she had felt some movement in the wind. Romantica recalled, looking worried, how the young man had been angry with her for making a mess. Desire smiles and hears that the girl will try. She looks at the ball lying in front of her, and pointing her hands at it, she begins to focus on moving it with the wind. The girl's eyes widen, and she tells herself that she has to succeed. Romantica watches the ball and surrounds it with the wind. Slowly, the power of self-hypnosis takes hold, and the ball starts to move just a little to the side. Desire watches and offers encouragement, praising her for the small progress. His words make the girl smile evilly, feeling pride at the praise from him. Suddenly, Desire turns to Pram, who sits on the box nearby. As soon as Pram hears his name, he shudders, looking up with hope in his eyes. He asks if it's his turn to show his skills. Desire scratches his cheek, listening to the boy's desire to train, yet confusion appears on his face. With a smile, he tells Pram that there's nothing more to teach him. Surprised, the boy opens his mouth and asks why, his face filled with disbelief. Desire sighs, exhaling deeply as he explains that the boy is already an excellent swordsman, and that alone is enough for the qualifying exam. Pram listens, a hint of disappointment crossing his face. Among the Alpha class, there are few with skills on par with his own. He asks Desire if what he said is true. Desire gazes at the boy seriously, his eyes meeting Pram's large ones. He thinks to himself that if Pram had used a rapier instead of a two-handed sword, he would have been even more formidable. Desire knows that Pram's skills with a rapier would have placed him at the forefront of any battle. It was because of his swordplay that Pram was among the survivors. Desire turns to the boy, his concern showing clearly on his face. He asks if he can ask Pram something, his voice gentle but firm. With a troubled look, Desire asks why Pram doesn't use a rapier anymore. Pram looks at him, a mix of confusion and fear in his eyes, dreading the question. But Desire's gaze is insistent, demanding an answer. Hanging his head, Pram finally asks how the teacher knew he had used one before. Desire feels embarrassed, unsure how to explain what he knew, but remains calm. The boy is trembling, gripping his knees tightly as Desire speaks. Desire explains that the strength of their group depends on this knowledge, and that he needs to understand. Slowly, Pram releases his grip on his knees and looks at the teacher, ready to open up. Desire, sensing the boy's hesitation, gently suggests they go for a walk, hoping to ease the tension between them. As the sky before sunset cast its final golden hues, the conversation inside the room continued. Pram, nearing the exit, asked if it would be right to leave Romantica alone. However, the main character did not grasp the concern in the boy's voice. Desire, sensing the hesitation, reassured Pram, explaining that Romantica was focused on her goals now, with no immediate danger. The boy, grinning, stepped closer to the exit. But just as he was about to leave, Pram hesitated and timidly turned to Desire, his words surprising the teacher. He revealed that he had never seen his father, a fact that seemed to haunt him. The hero, Desire, began to recount the story of the boy's past. His mother, a commoner, and his father, an aristocrat, created a stark contrast in the boy's life. Pram looked out of the window, where the last rays of the setting sun reflected off the glass, and quietly confessed that he was an illegitimate child. He then revealed the one thing his father had left him, a rapier. With that, the boy hurried away, leaving Desire alone on the large sofa, contemplating what had just been shared. As time passed, Pram returned, asking if he had kept Desire waiting. To the teacher's surprise, the boy was holding a long, weighty rapier, its presence commanding attention. Pram pulled the weapon from its case, explaining that it had been his father's gift, something to remember him by. Desire, intrigued, extended his hand, asking if he could examine the weapon. Pram agreed, and as Desire held the rapier, he was struck by how surprisingly light it was for such a weapon. He closely examined the handle, noticing an inscription that piqued his curiosity. Pram, sitting opposite Desire, began recounting his memories. At around the age of 6, he had first found the rapier, and it had become a symbol of his father's absence. Despite the pain of being raised without his father, Pram spent years honing his skills with the weapon. His mother, always watching with concern, had tears in her eyes every time he practiced, but she never stopped him. One day, after a particularly grueling training session, his mother had a heartfelt conversation with him. She urged him never to seek out his father, telling him that their worlds were far apart. She reassured him, offering a comforting touch to his cheek, but there was a sadness in her eyes that he could not ignore. She expressed her love for him, a love that would remain even in death. Then, in a tragic twist, his mother passed away quietly, leaving Pram alone, broken, and devastated. The boy explained to Desire, with a heavy heart, that even in her final moments, his mother never told him his father's name. As Desire listened, the pain in the boy's words became clearer. An illegitimate child, a symbol of shame for an aristocratic family, was left to wonder what would have happened if he had sought out his father. Desire felt a pang of regret, realizing that if Pram had done so, he might never have ended up in this academy. Desire's thoughts lingered on the boy's loss, understanding that even after death, the mother's protection remained. With a sense of deep sympathy, Desire looked at Pram, who, despite his mother's warnings, still longed to know who his father was. Pram explained that this longing had brought him to the academy, where nobles from all over the country studied. He hoped to find a clue to his father's identity here, and he believed the rapier was the only connection he had left. Desire, exhausted, examined the weapon on the table before him. Pram, disappointed, shared his belief that the rapier was nothing more than a cheap iron blade, a worthless trinket. The boy's eyes, filled with anger and sorrow, reflected the pain he felt. The one thing his father had left him was not a treasure but a reminder of abandonment. In a burst of frustration, Pram grabbed the rapier and hurled it across the room, its screeching fall echoing in the silence. The boy's voice trembled as he declared the weapon to be worthless. Desire, stunned by the outburst, watched as the rapier skidded across the floor. Tears streamed down Pram's face, his pain raw and visible. He collapsed to his knees, overwhelmed by grief, crying out for his mother. Desire, helpless and confused, watched in silence, trying to understand the depth of the boy's sorrow. As the dark night unfolded outside, Desire sat, lost in thought, beneath the starry sky. He had not realized the extent of Pram's inner turmoil. His heart ached as he wondered how he could possibly help the boy, who had suffered so much. Desire stood, his mind swirling with memories from his own battles. He recalled a time when he, too, had fought with a rapier. The weapon, once shining brightly in his memories, now held a new meaning. Pram, too, would one day pick up the rapier again, but the journey ahead would be long and filled with sorrow. Desire's gaze softened, the weight of understanding settling upon him. The boy's struggle was his own, and the rapier was more than just a weapon. It was a symbol of a past that neither could escape. As Desire's thoughts lingered on the young man's pain, he realized that his path and Pram's were intertwined in ways that could not yet be understood. It is morning, and a loud scream echoes through the house. He rushes into the room, shouting and wondering where Pram is. The boy, frightened by the sudden noise, stands frozen, his body numb, clutching a wooden sword. A man, with a serious expression, asks the boy for permission to examine the rapier again, hoping to take a closer look. Pram snorts and turns away, clearly uninterested in discussing it, gesturing with his hands. Desire, understanding, expresses his desire to examine the item further, eager to figure out what it is. The boy, still silent, purses his lips and watches him, clearly preoccupied with his thoughts. Suddenly, Desire speaks up, his voice soft with an apology for not being able to show her the rapier. The man, looking pleading, asks Pram once more for permission to look at it, even if just for a moment. Turning his gaze to the side, the boy explains that it is impossible. He has sold it. After some time, the group finds themselves in the shopping area of the academy. They walk through the various stalls, scanning everything from top to bottom, searching for what they need. Desire smiles as he gazes at the swimsuits, realizing that it has been a while since he last visited this place. In his previous life, he often came here for shopping. Lost in his thoughts, Desire suddenly hears Pram calling out, telling him they need to turn. Ahead of them is a long alley, and the boy reassures him that this is the direction they need to go. Desire, confused, looks at the unfamiliar place, a puzzled expression crossing his face. They walk further, and soon a sign appears in front of them. They find themselves standing in front of a two-story building, unsure whether to enter. The sign in front of the door reveals that the shop is owned by Woojukan, and it clearly states that no returns are accepted, even if the antiques are damaged or if the customer changes their mind. Desire realizes that the owner is a rather greedy person, unwilling to offer refunds or exchanges. Pram, with a serious yet slightly upset look, suddenly speaks, saying that he will never use the rapier again. After a moment of silence, they open the door and step inside. A passage bathed in bright light stretches before them, and as they walk through it, Desire notes that at the end of the corridor, they are met with an iron door. The size and design of the door suggests that the owner cares greatly about the security of the place. As they approach the door, a golden handle, shaped like a grinning man, appears before them. Desire reaches for it and knocks timidly on the door several times. The door creaks open, revealing a huge image of a giant man. Desire is surprised to see that a barbarian is employed as the guard. The man allows them inside, and Desire apologizes for their unannounced visit. Suddenly, a man appears before them, waving off the apology, saying that they don't look like thieves. Desire gazes at the man, curious about his strange appearance. The elderly man, with disheveled hair and a pipe in hand, greets them warmly, peering at them through his glasses. He mentions that there has been an increase in thieves recently and introduces himself as Woojukan. The old man then recognizes the boy, and with a curious expression, asks if he had been there recently. The boy nods, confirming he had come before. Woojukan asks why he has returned, his gaze turning stern as he looks at the young ones, questioning whether the boy intends to sell him something again. Desire steps in, explaining that they have come to look at the item Pram sold him. The old man, with an annoyed look, removes his glasses and slowly responds, reminding them that the store's sign clearly states that no returns are allowed. Desire, smiling, answers that they saw the sign, and they are not here to return the item but to redeem it. Woojukan bursts into loud, piercing laughter at the young man's words, realizing their intentions. He hands the rapier back to them, admitting that he did not understand their purpose at first. He adds, however, that the blade is rusted and in poor condition. He smirks, throwing his feet up on the table, and notes that the item doesn't even resemble a proper rapier. It is too large and light for one, and as he exhales smoke from his pipe, he casts a scornful glance at the buyers. Woojukan was witnessing something for the first time, yet he instantly recognized it as an ornamental sword, an item often given by nobles as a token of affection. He glanced at the sword again and, turning to the potential buyer, asked if he truly wished to purchase it. The buyer nodded, his eyes cold and sharp. With a sinister look, Woojukan declared that the price for such a piece was 40 silver coins. Suddenly, Pram exploded in anger, shouting that he had not been told the sword was ornamental. He reminded everyone that the man had sold it to him for only 90 bronze coins. Woojukan exhaled a puff of smoke and turned away, his expression stern and businesslike. In a calm tone, the owner responded, explaining that Pram had specifically asked for the price of the rapier itself, which is why the agreed sum was so low. The sword, after all, was nothing more than a cheap, ordinary iron blade. Pram, frustrated and enraged, called Woojukan nothing but a pathetic scammer, accusing him of deception. At that moment, a voice cut through the tension, commanding everyone to stop this nonsense. Tears welled in Pram's eyes, but the owner, unmoved, snapped that 40 silver coins was already a bargain. Pointing his pipe at the two, he suggested that had he known how to open the sword, he could have sold it for 80 silver coins. The owner's gaze shifted back to Desire, asking once more if he was willing to buy. Just then, the sound of silver coins scattered across the table filled the air, ringing as they settled. Desire, having placed the coins down, confirmed that he indeed wanted to purchase the sword. Woojukan, exhaling smoke in Desire's direction, smiled and remarked that had he known the buyer would agree so easily, he would have raised the price even higher. Desire, lowering his gaze, calmly replied that by doing so, Woojukan had disgraced himself as a merchant. A few moments passed before Desire extended the sword toward Pram, who took it reluctantly but warned that he had no intention of using such a cheap weapon. Desire reassured him with a simple request to trust him. Holding the rapier in his hands, Desire pointed out a small groove in the handle. He instructed Pram to gently press his fingernail into it, and as Pram examined the blade, he finally noticed the groove. As his finger made contact, there was a sudden click, and the mystery of the sword began to unfold. Pulling the blade from its case, a bright, piercing light began to fill the room. Pram tossed the case aside and raised the sword high, his eyes wide with surprise. Woojukan watched with a mix of incomprehension and envy, staring at the shiny blade he had sold for a mere fraction of its value. The young boy could only gaze at it in awe, unable to understand why the sword glowed with such light. Desire grinned and explained that the rapier was crafted from blank sham, which made it unusually light. At that moment, a man, leaning on the table, seemed surprised by the mention of blank sham. He placed his finger to his lips, whispering if it was truly made from it. Blank sham, a material stronger than steel, could never break or wear out, and any swordsman would covet it. On top of that, its lightness made items made from it nearly weightless. Desire speculated that this was why the boy was confused, thinking there was nothing inside the blade. As Pram felt the thin but durable material, he was taken aback by its strength. The main character recalled that it was this very rapier that the boy would have wielded in his past life. Turning to face the boy, Desire suggested they take the rapier and leave the place. But as they approached the exit, a barbarian stepped forward, blocking their path. Woojukan's eyes narrowed in suspicion as he realized the barbarian was likely about to resort to underhanded tactics to seize the blade. The owner of the shop suddenly twisted his face in distaste and demanded that the young men hand over the rapier. Pram, overwhelmed, began to shed tears. Seeing this, the barbarian guard turned his weapon away, allowing Pram and the boy to walk past. Desire noted how selfish the owner was, far more so than he had originally assumed. With a twisted expression, Woojukan growled, claiming that he understood the value of the rapier better than they did. Desire locked eyes with him, delivering a sharp, insidious gaze. He reminded the owner that he had sold them an ornamental sword, and Desire had paid a fair price for it. The owner, still uneasy, looked at them with suspicion, muttering that if he had known the rapier was made from blank sham, he would never have sold it. Desire's response was calm but pointed, saying that if Pram had known it was an ornamental sword, he never would have sold it either. Woojukan's anger grew, his teeth grinding with fury. He accused the main character of being a petty swindler. Desire remained unbothered, calmly responding that he had only done what was done to them. The barbarian, standing behind the owner, looked at Desir with confusion but did not move. The main character, unaffected, demanded that the owner open the door because he and Pram were leaving. The barbarian, confused by the order, awaited his command. But Woojukin made a gesture around his neck, signaling that no one would leave the room alive. The barbarian then declared that they would stand still, following the owner's orders. He placed his sword on his massive shoulder and told Desir and Pram to remain where they were. Desir, looking up at the giant, noted how his speech reminded him of a friend from his past. He suddenly remembered his friend Dawn. A loud crash echoed above Desir's head, but he quickly dodged the attack. The barbarian stood, shocked, looking at the shattered floor, surprised that the boy had managed to evade the strike. Desir grinned at the giant's confusion. Just then, the owner's voice rang out, ordering the barbarian to kill them. The guard looked back at Woojukin in confusion but nodded, preparing to follow the order. He lifted his sword and advanced toward the boy. In that moment, Pram stood between the barbarian and Desir, his rapier drawn. He demanded the barbarian step back, stating that he would not hesitate to fight if necessary. The barbarian and his master exchanged uncertain glances, unsure how to proceed. Desir turned to the boy, asking if he was certain he was ready. The boy, angry, replied that he was indeed ready. Desir then reminded the boy of the promise he made never to use the rapier. The boy laughed nervously, trying to explain himself. Desir reassured him that he was under his protection now. Nodding, the boy prepared himself. The barbarian, sensing the tension, charged forward, drawing his sword. Pram stood firm, telling the boy to stay behind him and not interfere. Seconds later, a sharp sound rang in the air, and several strands of Pram's hair flew to the side as the barbarian's sword narrowly missed him. The boy swiftly retaliated, delivering a powerful blow and standing his ground, facing his opponent. Desir observed the boy's movements, noting that they were drastically different from how he fought with a two-handed weapon. The boy's posture was solid, and Desir couldn't help but feel a surge of pride. As Pram prepared for his next move, Desir realized that the boy still lacked real combat experience, and doubt crept in. Would Pram be able to handle this fight? The barbarian looked at the boy, sensing something different in him. Just as he was about to make his move, Pram surged forward, his eyes blazing with excitement, grinning as he embraced the fight. A loud laugh erupted from the barbarian, and he taunted the boy, calling him a small warrior. Desir, observing the scene, couldn't help but smile at how the situation was unfolding.